That he
That is
created a phony
8%.
photo op.
Right.
I mean, this is
Never
the
tried to find
thing.
it.
Phony
It
photo
doesn't
op.
matter.
Anyway, I got to wrap it up. Adam, Liz, Horace,
Thanks
great
for
to see
having
you
me
all.
on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, your Nobel Peace Prize winning European Union is demanding that indebted nations like Greece and Portugal privatize all their water resources if they want to continue receiving bailouts. As in, you want to stay in the Eurozone? Then hand over your most precious commons to transnational corporations. This is in line with a broader privatization agenda that we're seeing all around the world, especially here in the United States, as water, roads, schools, prisons, you name it, are all being privatized and taken out of the hands of we the people. In my opinion, these are assaults on democracy. But one thing that Europe hasn't done, the one thing that Europe has crossed off and said, no way are we privatizing that, is the vote. But here in the United States, from coast to coast, we have privatized the vote. And in doing so, we've removed the linchpin holding together our democracy. Several European nations, including Ireland, Germany, and the Netherlands, have experimented with and then ditched electronic voting machines. In fact, Germany's Supreme Court ruled that e-voting machines were unconstitutional. And Ireland sold theirs for penny on the dollar as scrap metal. But here in the United States, we continue to put out more and more e-voting machines owned by corporations that seem to have vested political interests. That's despite the fact that it's pretty well documented that such machines may have flipped political races in favor of Republicans. Take, for example, what happened in Nebraska in 1996. Republican Chuck Hagel, running on an e-voting machine company, secured a huge contract to sell his machines to Nebraska, then decided to run for Senate in Nebraska against Ben Nelson. And guess what? Despite being a long-shot candidate, Hagel won. Or at least that's what his own voting machines calculated, or at least some of them. The Washington Post said this, following the surprise victory, Hagel's Senate victory against an incumbent Democratic governor, was the major Republican upset in the November election. That's as in nationwide. And as Bev Harris, who wrote the book on black box voting, pointed out, Hagel inexplicably won nearly every voter demographic and won in largely African-American communities that had never even voted Republican. He was the first Republican senator elected in Nebraska in 24 years, and he was elected in part on these voting machines. Something similar happened in Georgia in 2002. According to polls heading into Election Day, Democratic Senator Max Cleland had a 5-point lead over his Republican challenger, Saxby Chambliss. But after the votes were counted on the machines, Chambliss ended up winning by 7 points. Not a single poll heading into the election showed Chambliss with a lead, let alone a 7-point lead. Yet, that's what the corporate voting machines said happened. No paper trail, no record, and Chambliss went on to serve in the Senate. Despite all this weird stuff with e-voting machines, in 2002, George W. Bush signed into law the Help America Vote Act, which set aside $3.9 billion for polling stations to replace traditional voting methods with e-voting machines. And since then, our use of e-voting in our elections has exploded. Ahead of the 2004 election, the CEO of Diebold, a major e-voting machine company, promised to deliver Ohio's electoral votes to George W. Bush. Of course, Bush narrowly won Ohio amid numerous well-documented accounts of election fraud in that state, including ballot box stuffing, voter caging, and, you guessed it, e-voting machine manipulation. In 2007, 3 years after the election, Ohio's Secretary of State concluded in an official study that the state's e-voting machines had, quote, critical security failures that could impact the integrity of elections in the Buckeye State, end of quote. In other words, the Ohio election could have easily been stolen or delivered to Bush, just as Diebold's CEO promised. That's what happens when you privatize voting, when you hand it over to private, for-profit corporations. And now, history is repeating itself. Heading into this year's election, a quarter of all the votes cast will be on e-voting machines that don't have paper trails and have been shown over and over again to be easily hacked. And some of these machines just so happen to be owned by people affiliated with Mitt Romney. As the Free Press reported, Bain alumni, now raising big money as Romney bundlers, are also in the electronic voting machine business. This appears to be a repeat of the infamous former CEO of Diebold, Wally Odell, who raised money for Bush while his company supplied voting machines and election management software in the 2004 election. In Texas, Washington, Colorado, Hawaii, Oklahoma, and Ohio, e-voting machines will be used that are owned by a company called Hart Intercivic. Hart Intercivic is partly owned by a capital investment firm known as HIG Capital. 11 investors at HIG Capital used to work at Mitt Romney's Bain Capital, and 2 of them are currently bundlers for the Romney campaign. In other words, the private operators of these e-voting machines may have already picked the guy they want to win. This is not how our democracy should work. I mean, even if it's not this bad, just looking this bad. But this is what happens when you privatize the vote. We've devoted many segments in this show to this creeping privatization agenda, to the efforts to inject the profit motive into our commons. From water facilities in Detroit, to schools in Chicago, to public parks in Benton Harbor, Michigan. We, the people's democratic control of our commons is being taken away by transnational corporations. These are critical sins against democracy, violations of democracy. But privatizing the vote itself is a moral sin, and a mortal sin, actually, against democracy itself. And this sin might be what hands this year's election off to the oligarchs once again, just as they've been doing since 2000. Thomas Paine described the vote as the beating heart of democracy. If we can talk about privatizing schools or water supplies, but the vote, the thing that is at the center of the entire thing, this needs to become a major issue. We need to do like Ireland and sell these machines as if they were just scrap metal, pennies on the dollar, and get rid of them. And that's the way it is tonight, Friday, October 19th, 2012. For more information on any of the stories we covered, visit our websites at thomhartmann.com, freespeech.org, and rt.com. And if you missed any of tonight's show, you can now watch it in HD on Hulu at hulu.com/thebigpicture. Also check out our 2 YouTube channels. There are links at thomhartmann.com. Also at thomhartmann.com, check out all the different ways you can send us your feedback. And don't forget, democracy begins with you. Not just a spectator sport. You got to participate. Show up. Go to movetoamend.org. Go to pdamerica.org. Get out there, get active. Occupy something. Tag, you're it. See you next week.